On the night of March 16, 1751, in Belgrove Plantation, a frail baby boy was born to James Madison Sr. and Nellie Conway. His name was James Madison Jr. No one really expected much from James Madison, as he was a short and sickly child. Subject to many life-threatening diseases, he was forced to stay at his home for most of his childhood. Within the confines of his home, James Madison retired to the library, where he studied on his own. Eventually, this small man was accepted into the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton University. Being the smart man he was, James Madison graduated from the College of New Jersey in 2 years. When he returned to Montpelier, his home, he studied law on his own, but found that he had no passion for it. In 1774, James Madison took a seat on the local Committee of Safety. 2 years later, in 1776, with the colonies ready to wage war against Great Britain, James Madison was swept into the fierce debate over independence. During this time period, James Madison became a delegate on the Virginia House of Delegates, where he befriended Thomas Jefferson, the future drafter of the Declaration of Independence, third President of the United States, and Madison's mentor, trusted advisor, and close friend. Because of his friendship with Thomas Jefferson, Madison found himself rapidly rising up the political ladder. At age 29, he became the youngest member of the Continental Congress. Though he was quite small and wispy-looking, Madison was always well prepared for each meeting. Madison's preparations were not made in vain. While leading the Virginian delegation in Philadelphia during the Constitutional Convention, Madison introduced the Virginia Plan, which called for a bicameral legislature as well as a judiciary that included the Supreme Court. After several compromises, Madison emerged from the meeting as the father of the Constitution, a title he politely declined. Unfortunately for Madison, his idea for a strong central government was not well received among certain factions of citizens. From this controversy, two political parties had formed: the Federalists, who favored a strong central government and ratification of the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who favored a weak federal government and opposed the ratification of the Constitution. To convince the Anti-Federalists that the Constitution was the best course of action for America's future, Madison, along with John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, wrote the Federalist Papers under the pseudonym Plubius. In Federalist No. 10, Madison wrote,
"When a majority is included in a faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens. To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed."
In addition to writing the Federalist Papers, Madison also contributed to the eventual ratification of the Constitution by formally introducing the idea of a Bill of Rights. Although viewed as arbitrary at the time, the Bill of Rights convinced anti-Federalist states to agree with the ratification. It was around this time that Madison first encountered a very important person in his life, Dolly Payne Todd. After only a few months of courtship, Todd and Madison married on September 15, 1794. Dolly Madison would later become First Lady of the United States and is now often credited for defining the role of the First Lady. Following his success with the Constitution, Madison continued his ascent up the American political ladder after Thomas Jefferson was elected president in 1800. Madison was appointed Secretary of State and served during both terms of Jefferson's presidency. As Secretary of State, he was first involved in the landmark Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison in 1803, which established the practice of judicial review for the Supreme Court. During his service as Secretary of State, Madison also oversaw the Louisiana Purchase, the acquisition of the French territory, Louisiana. Today, this area includes 15 current states and 2 Canadian provinces, totaling 828,000 square miles of land. In 1808, at the end of the second term of the presidency, Jefferson decided to retire, just as Madison began expressing interest in running for president. In the election, he was challenged by Federalist Charles Pinckney. Madison emerged the winner with running mate George Clinton, winning by a total of 122 electoral votes and 124,732 popular votes. He was inaugurated on March 4, 1809. During Madison's presidency, domestic affairs took a backseat as foreign affairs took precedence, primarily with Great Britain. Through a series of trade restrictions on the U.S., attacks on American ships, impressment of American merchant sailors, and support of Indian raids on American attempts to expand territory, The conflict eventually escalated into the War of 1812, the Second War of Independence, and the defining event of Madison's presidency. On June 18, 1812, Congress formally declared war on Great Britain, and battles began. Perhaps the most memorable incident to emerge from this war was the burning of Washington on August 24, 1812. After nearly 3 years of fighting, the war culminated with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent on December 24, 1814. The treaty did not change boundaries or address impressment, but it restored the British-American relationship to the way it was pre-War of 1812. After the War of 1812, the Second War of Independence, Americans had finally secured independence from the British. With the Federalist Party dissolved and disappeared, the era of good feelings commenced. Later in his presidency, Madison passed a tariff on British goods, reversed his previous opposition to a national bank by signing the charter for the Second Bank of the United States, and vetoing the Bonus Bill of 1817, which would have funded internal improvements. After finishing his 2 terms in office as president, James Madison retired to his home in Virginia, where he had spent most of his remaining years directing his plantation's holdings and slaves. At the same time, James Madison lent out his voice to different causes by serving on the Board of Visitors at the University of Virginia, a college Thomas Jefferson had founded after his presidency, and eventually succeeded Jefferson as the head of the university in 1826. In 1829, Madison served as a delegate at the Virginia Constitutional Convention. There, James Madison began negotiating compromises between slaveholders and farmers. Later on, James Madison began to suffer from chronic rheumatism and liver dysfunction. 6 months later, on June 28, 1836, James Madison died while eating his breakfast. Madison was buried in the family cemetery in Montpelier. He will always remain in the thoughts and laws of the United States through the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. James Madison will always be remembered as one of the most influential and important founding fathers of the United States of America.